want to talk a little bit today about something I came across on another channel. There's a video called The Simple Novel Writing Hack I'd Wish I'd Known When I Started Out. And the hack in question is what's known as the placeholder hack. And it's remarkably simple. When you're in the middle of writing a scene and you get stuck, the way out of this is just to write a quick placeholder note, maybe with some kind of special character tag so that you can find it with a search and replace. And you use this note to tell your future self what you want to accomplish for the scene. Not just what will happen, but what your goal is, what your larger intentions are for having the scene exist in the story. So for instance, you could say something like, by the end of this scene, we will realize our protagonist has gambled on the wrong strategy, but he doesn't yet know it. That's for later. You notice we didn't actually describe how that happens. We just give the larger 30,000 foot view. Now, I want to say first off, I love this trick. It's a liberator because it sets you free of the idea that you must walk in absolutely linear fashion through whatever plan you have for a story, assuming you have one in the first place and you're not just pantsing the whole thing. And if you are a pantser, this gives you that much more freedom to nail things down in an elegant way. But I kind of plan things aggressively. And in that case, I asked myself, well, how do I use this trick? What do I actually put there in this note in place of the scene if I'm that insistent on things having a firm structure? Another way I could put this question is, what implications does this tactic have for world building, for stories that need integrity ahead of time? Does using placeholders run the risk of upsetting that? And you can see how this is important when you're writing science fiction fantasy. Well, here's what I found from my own experience from having written a bunch of books so far. And it's that if I have a spot in a story where I'm tempted to use a placeholder because I'm stuck on how to move things forward, then the first thing I ask myself is, why am I stuck? Because there are three likely reasons for this. One, I have a world building problem. Two, I have a storytelling problem. Three, I have a habit keeping problem. They're all different. I'm going to start with the last of those first, the habit-keeping problem. And I'm using that phrase, habit-keeping, instead of terms like discipline or motivation, as a way to really zoom in on what the actual difficulty is. Because I should really make a separate video about this, but I don't like terms like discipline and motivation because I think they miss the point. I think it is easier to form and keep habits, because those are internal, than to use motivations or disciplinary tools, which are external, to keep your work going. So the way being stuck like this manifests most commonly when you have a habit-keeping problem. It's when you sit down and you open the manuscript and you look at it and you say to yourself something like, I just don't feel like writing this right now. Now, some days that's totally legit. You spent the whole day fending off phone calls, or you spent half your day sitting in a car dealership waiting room while they did $900 worth of service on your car. All you want to do is veg. But here you are in front of the word processor. And it's worth trying to get past easy dismissals like, I just don't want to do it right now. Is it really because it's been a tough day? Or is it because what you're about to do requires some effort that you don't feel adequately prepared for? And that could in turn be due to a few things, which leads me to the other two things I mentioned as the possible blockers: storytelling and world building. Now, the first of these, storytelling, this means, translated into the language of I don't want to do this, I don't feel like writing this scene because it isn't very dynamic. There's not a lot happening in it. It's just people talking, and they're not driving the movement of the story forward in a way that's palpable, whether to me or to the audience. And there's a good chance it also doesn't have any measurable impact on the world building. There's nothing happening in this scene that expands our understanding of the world, that changes the way we need to think about it, that throws light on it. Now, for a scene like that, there is a fair chance the scene doesn't even belong in the story in the first place. Because if you want to placeholder a scene because it just doesn't seem to be doing anything or illustrating anything, there's a good chance you can just drop it. But you can put in the placeholder and have a note to that effect. Maybe something else will make this scene worth writing in retrospect once you get further along. That you will find, as I call it, a liberty, something that you can use that scene for as a receptacle for information about the world or some way to drive things forward. Sometimes this will happen with a scene where I have like a cool thing that happens. It's like, oh, I want to put that on the page. It's cool. It's part of my original concept for this whole thing. I don't want to just drop it on the floor. But it doesn't actually move action. It doesn't explain anything. It's just cosmetic. And so I say to myself, well, I got this far without it. I can just placeholder it. And if something comes up later where I can use it elegantly as a receptacle for that, then I'll do it. So now we come to the third reason that you might want to placeholder a scene. The scene does change something big. Maybe it affects part of your world building. Maybe it's a gigantic revelation of character, but you're not sure about the details. You don't know how to write the scene. You don't know how to convey the information. You don't know how to actually make those changes in the world. And it doesn't even have to be a gigantic seismic change. It's just something you realize you haven't thought about in detail. And that itself can be a blocker. And this is where we use the power of what I call gaming things out. The idea being that you take the various implications for what is in your scene. What could this mean? What are all the things that could come from this? Positive, negative, neutral. And then you go and explore them somewhere outside of the actual manuscript. And it doesn't even have to be super involved. It can be just a couple of bullet points. So let's say we've realized that we can't write a given scene because we're about to use some piece of technology that we've created for our world. But we've just realized that there's all of these other ways that tech could be used that could totally upend our story, that might even undermine it completely. And so you could game that out in a couple of ways. You could say, number one, all right, this changes things more than I realized. I'm going to embrace that. I'm going to bite the bullet. I'm going to go back. I'm going to rethink my story's premise to include those bigger changes. And as painful as that can be, it can also be tremendously rewarding because you take what amounts to an okay story and trade it up for a much better, more ambitious, more completely thought out one. Option number two, you can say, okay, this thing changes a lot, but I don't actually have to change the whole story to include it. I can just change some bits of it. Like you could come up with a relatively solid justification for why this particular tech doesn't actually change everything. Maybe it's a sociological reason. Maybe it's because the thing in question is still experimental, doesn't really do what it's advertised to do, that kind of thing. So by gaming stuff like this out, you have a more concrete sense of what needs to be changed and to what end and what you would need to do to accomplish that. I want to digress for a moment and talk a little bit about pantsing because I mentioned it in passing and I think it's worth bringing up here when talking about placeholders and such. Pantsing, for those who don't know, it's short for writing by the seat of your pants, rather than from a formal plot or plan. You just sit down in the chair and go. And there are some people who find this approach extremely appealing, especially when writing speculative fiction of one kind or another, because it gives them the freedom to wander around in the world they're building before they feel like it's actually been built. It's more like they're discovering that world instead of constructing it. It's the in the trenches view as opposed to the 30,000-foot view. So you're not trying to write the story in that sense. You're just experimenting with what it's like to go into that story's world and bump around for a bit and see what happens. And it gives you a tremendous amount of freedom without having to commit to anything. The downside is that it can also come at the feeling of this being a sunk cost. I wrote all this stuff. I should include it somewhere. So one of the things the placeholder can be useful for here is to speed up the process of wandering through that setting. That you can say to yourself, okay, I started to write this scene and then I said, oh, I've got a general idea now of what that amounts to. So I'm just gonna finish off with a placeholder about what this encounter in this part of the world amounts to in the bigger picture. I'll move on to the next thing. And if you start to write that and you realize, wait a minute, I don't really know what that amounts to, then guess what? You've learned something about your world. Maybe you do want to write that scene out, in an even freer way than you had originally envisioned, just to see what happens. So to sum up, this whole business of using a placeholder is not just a way to speed up the writing of the story. It's not just a way to get you to the end of a draft faster and be able to go back over it and fill things in. It's a discovery process. It's a way for you to discover how much of your world you really know about, how much of the people you know about, all the rest of it. And the fact that you have to use a placeholder is not itself a failure. In fact, it's a brave thing to do because it means that you're giving yourself freedom and permission and courage to plant these flags in the ground and say, yes, I have the wherewithal to come back to this and finish the job. So by all means, give yourself that freedom. Plant those flags in the ground. Just remember to pull them back up later when you're done. That's it for this video. Let me know what you think. And until next time, stay curious.